Things about Tabernacles is that it teaches a powerful lesson on things. You know, y'all have heard perhaps that hospitality is a very important thing in the Jewish world and the Middle Eastern world, right? Y'all have heard that, right? Familiar with that? One of the examples demonstrated for that is Abraham. He is lifted up as an example of someone willing, at any time, really to welcome and serve a traveler that comes across his path. Abraham did this, when Adonai appeared to him at Mamre in Genesis 18 with those three heavenly men, one of them being Adonai in this physical form. I believe that was Yeshua. But Abraham welcomed them to his tent and served them this meal. He serves as this example. And what we have to take from that is the same thing can happen to us at times. We hear this in Hebrews 13. He says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing so some have entertained angels without knowing it." That's a reference back to Genesis 18. That's what's happening. That's what the author of Hebrews is referring to. That's a well-known account. And so he essentially had, a lot of times when you say someone's having an open house, what does that usually mean? Usually means like they're trying to sell their place, right? And they want people to be able to come in and see the place and consider buying it. Well, an open house really is what we are supposed to have. That's what kind of house that Abraham himself had. It was an open house to entertain, to be able to serve those that in need as they crossed his path. And this open house idea is really found in the very first letter of the first word of the scriptures. What's that word there? Do y'all know that one? Better sheet, right? The first letter is the letter Beit. Now, some people I've talked to, some commentators I've heard, like to say that God should have started with the first letter of the Hebrew language, Aleph, right? Instead of, it starts with Beit. And I think that's on purpose. I think that's intentional. Because as you know, the letters themselves have meaning, they have symbolism. The name of this letter is called, we call it Beit, which means what? House. It's a dwelling place. It's a tent in that respect. It's what is the purpose of having a house? I mean, men, when we're single, when we're on our own, do we really care what kind of place we live in? No. We'll be satisfied living in a car, whatever else, an overhang of a rock, we'll sleep under something like that. And some people pay good money to do that kind of stuff, and I think they're crazy, but they'll do it. Men don't really care what kind of house we live in until something happens. Men must have some kind of dwelling place if they intend to have a bride, if they intend to have a family. Because men or women have much better sense and taste than we do, don't they? Most of y'all, you're not laughing or not affirming this as much. You guys must have a great situation going on. You must have great taste, these men, right? Who does the decorating in your place, by the way? Yeah, you do. Most of the time it's who? 9 times out of 99 times, or 999 times out of 1,000, right? Most of the time it's the ladies that do that. If we want to have some kind of dwelling place, if we intend to have a family, we've got to have this house. A bridegroom searching for a bride builds his house to show that the time is right. Because in that house will live your offspring. You give them shelter, you provide them their needs, you train them as they grow. And God started the book with Beit because he is building a house. He is building a house with which his children, the children of God, are going to live, grow, and thrive. The temple especially is known as what? It's known as the house of God, isn't it? Yeshua himself says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And when you look at the letter, notice how many sides or how many lines of this letter are there? It only has 3 sides, right? It's got a foundation, it's got a back wall, so to speak, and it's got a roof, with one side being open. One side is always open. It is essentially the door, the entrance to the house, and it's supposed to symbolize a symbol of welcome and hospitality. It's a house of prayer for who? For all the nations, right? So the first letter of the first word of the Scriptures conveys really what God is doing, where He is going, where He wants to take everything. It conveys His heart of hospitality and welcome as He builds a house for His family and all who pass by. That's His heart. It's the heart of what Tabernacles represents. Because what are we supposed to do when we build our sukkah? Every night, what do? We welcome some people, right? We welcome Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We welcome those people. We welcome travelers and visitors to come and share the meal in the sukkah with us. That's the custom, that's the practice. So the Beit in many ways represents Tabernacles as it reveals God's desire to dwell with His people, and it represents the end. It's really the goal of the Messianic era and the Olam Haba, the world to come, that His children are dwelling with Him. Tabernacles points to that. God's house, and His door being open, that He is inviting us into. Shabbat is an invitation to spend the day with Him. He's inviting us over to His house to spend with Him. So what this is an open house. The Tabernacles is the goal. It is a picture of the wedding feast. It's where God wants to take us so that we can fully celebrate our union with Him. But what happens, as with many things, as in many families, what we want or what we think or what we expect sometimes gets in the way. Y'all ever notice that? Expectations sometimes get in the way. This shows up in John chapter 7 as Tabernacles draws near. We want to follow along. He says, after these events, Yeshua was walking about in the Galilee. He did not want to walk in Judea because the Judean leaders were wanting to kill Him. Right? So there was still some hostility. There was still some anger and people being upset toward Him among the leadership at the temple. But there's this issue. Now the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near. Now, if you know that, there are people in Knoxville that want to kill me, where do I not want to go? I'm not going to want to go I'm not going to be highly motivated to go to Knoxville. But what if I have to? See, there were people in and around Jerusalem that had it in for Yeshua. And yet, did He have to go? Yes. Yeshua, or Tabernacles, is one of those pilgrimage feasts. So there was this tension. What does He do? This doesn't seem very hospitable to me, to want to kill somebody. The ones in charge of the temple already had it in their minds to kill Him. That's just an amazing thing to hold on to, because He's already been controversial with some of His teachings, some of His claims, some of the things that He has said. The last time that He was there was in chapter 5, and He healed a man on the Shabbat. Look in John chapter 5. He says, because Yeshua was doing these things on Shabbat, the Judean leaders started persecuting Him. Right? They had a problem with that. It says, but Yeshua said to them, my Father is still working, and I also am working. And so for this reason, it escalated. It got worse. The Judean leaders kept trying even harder to kill Him, because He was not only breaking Shabbat, but also calling God His own Father, making himself equal with God. That's how they understood this conversation, this statement that he made. So clearly what Yeshua was doing and saying was was ruffling a few feathers and expectations and well-established theological rules. Their thoughts were, along the line of, when they hear that statement from him, my Father is still working, their thought, their line of thinking is, well, God is not, you don't say my Father as in uniquely yours. He is our Father. Isn't that what we were singing about earlier? Avinu, Melkenu, our Father, our King. He's not uniquely yours, but he was claiming a unique relationship. And the works that you are doing, Yeshua, are not the same kind of works that the Father does and continues to do. And so they were clearly upset at these actions, at his words, as we probably would be today ourselves if someone showed up saying something like that. Wouldn't we? Honestly? Especially if we didn't believe what the person was claiming? Yeah, we would have a problem with that. And so these authorities see Yeshua as trouble, as a false teacher, as somebody who might incur the wrath of the Romans. And even Yeshua's family, his half-brothers at the time, didn't support what he was doing either. They were, the way they act in coming to try to collect him from time to time, it's almost as if they were embarrassed by the whole thing, that they wanted this season, this experiment of being this rabbi to end so he'd come home, right? And you get that impression. And that conversation, again, happens more than once. So their thinking seems to be the quickest way to end all of this was for them to push Yeshua back onto the main stage at Jerusalem, where this good old country boy would be humbled in the big city and give up this crazy dream of being a rabbi. That's what happens in verse 3. But so the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near. Therefore his brothers said to him, well, leave here and go to Judea, so your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. No one who wants to be well known does everything in secret. If you are doing these things, show yourself to the world. Don't stay around in the backwaters of the Galilee. Go where the action takes place. Go to Jerusalem. But here's the reason why they wanted that. For not even his brothers had faith in him. They weren't trusting. They didn't believe him. They're essentially taunting him. Taunting Yeshua. So your disciples also may see. You've got this great big crowd of followers, you say, that you supposedly have. They're all just waiting on you to show up, waiting to hear all of these great words and teachings that you have, because you're so popular and all. You're doing all these big miracles and such. And so if you want to be a big star in this world, what do they say do today? If you want to be a star, you got to go where? Go to Hollywood, right? In this case, they meant Jerusalem. They didn't really believe that Yeshua would succeed. They thought he would essentially fall flat on his face and come limping back home. And I don't think they really, his brothers anyway, really understood the danger that he was in. So they're taunting with him. They're trying to get him to go, and let's put an end to this dream of yours. So it goes on. It says, therefore Yeshua said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time, that's always at hand. It says, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that its works are evil. You go on up to the feast. I'm not going to this feast, because my time hasn't yet fully come. And after saying these things, he stayed in the Galilee. So his brothers and such, what they wanted to happen, what they had as their agenda, was getting away of really what God's agenda was in all of this. Your time is always at hand. You want everything to happen on your terms. You want everything to happen in your time. the way that you want, the way that you plan, the way that you expected. I mean, have we changed all that much, or are we still just as impatient for things to happen? We want things to happen now. We want it to happen when we say so, right? We haven't really changed all that much. And honestly, that's one of the things that makes hospitality difficult. How often do you schedule for the stranger to show up at your door? Does it usually come when it's most convenient for you? No. That's what reveals the heart about the hospitality. We don't like strangers and travelers just stopping by and interrupting our routine, coming when we least expect them, because it disrupts our sensibilities. It disrupts the things that we have planned, right? So both the Judean leaders and Yeshua's brothers, they're demonstrating an unwillingness to entertain Adonai when he shows up, like Abraham was willing to. They're both demonstrating that same thing. They wanted to keep the door to God's house open or closed at whose decision? At their own, right? They wanted to be essentially the gatekeepers for these things. And there are always going to be barriers and obstacles to the move and the work of God. Sometimes it's going to be the earthly authorities. Sometimes it's even those who are closer to us, like family, that are going to try to keep us from following in his ways. There are always going to be reasons. There's always going to be excuses. There's always going to be objections to the things of God. How many of y'all have experienced some of those? I know you have. The world has no problem with the way it likes to do things. The world likes to claim that it welcomes all kinds of diversity, all kinds of philosophies, all kinds of ideas and expressions, lifestyles and such. But when you start talking about there being a right way, when you start talking about being that there's an only way, a godly way, that's the one thing that the world is not going to tolerate. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. Yeshua testifies that the ways of the world are evil, that they don't really align with God's ways. And so many, an increasing variety, don't even try. The ones that think they do, the ones that think that their lives and their understanding actually do align with the ways of God, are often the ones most hostile to hearing that they aren't. You ever notice that? But because in this instance, because it was not the right time, because their motives were not the right motives, Yeshua did not want to travel with them, did not want to go on their agenda, on their timetable to the feast. He did not travel with them. But it is still a pilgrimage feast. And so Yeshua has to be there, and everybody knows it. Because if he doesn't go, if he doesn't obey the command, what's the problem? Is that a sin against God? Yeah. So in John chapter 7, verse 10, it says, after his brothers went to the feast, he also went, not openly, but secretly. He didn't go with a big entourage. He didn't go and make a show of his entry. I mean, he's somewhat of a celebrity. People are talking about him. But he is not trying to draw attention because it's not his time. It says, then the Judean leaders were searching for him at the feast and kept asking, where is that fellow? And there were a lot of murmuring about him in the crowd. Some were saying he's good. Others were saying not so. He leads the people astray. Yet no one spoke openly about him for fear of these Judean leaders. So Yeshua, he comes to the house of God. He comes to his Father's house in obedience to the command to gather with God's people, but not when and not in the way that everybody wanted him to, not drawing attention to himself like everybody expected him to. When his time has fully come, when he is going to come on his own terms, is he going to go up and fulfill tabernacles in the same way that he fulfilled Passover? Yeah. See, the fall feasts he is going to fulfill just as he already has, from our perspective, he has fulfilled the spring. Dying on Passover, the son cleansing or removing the leaven from his father's house during unleavened bread, raising on first fruits, sending the Ruach HaKodesh on Shavuot. In the fall, he will come to be crowned as king on the coronation day of Yom Teruah, sit enthroned as the king on Yom Kippur, and judge the nations, and come essentially as the groom to celebrate the wedding feast with tabernacles. That's what all of this pictures. But those days have not come yet. The groom has not yet been announced. Other things have to be taken care of first in this time, in John chapter 7. Other things have to be dealt with. Sin must be dealt with first. The spring feasts and what they foreshadow still need to be addressed. And though everybody was ready, as we talked about last night, they all wanted a king to be like the other nations. Everybody wants a king. But for our redemption to be possible, for us to be able to stand before the king's presence, for us to be able to see the king face to face and live, our sin has to be atoned for. Our redemption must be purchased. We cannot skip the spring feast and skip straight to the fall, where the king is on the throne. We can't skip to that moment where the king is coming in power and glory, because how many of us would survive if our sin has not been dealt with? Anybody? Nobody. Because it was not yet time. He traveled quietly. He didn't do it openly. He did it secret. For the first few days, he keeps a low profile. Then it says in verse 14, about halfway through the feast, Yeshua went up to the temple and began teaching. All of a sudden, it starts getting public. And then, it didn't take him long to notice. Then the Judean leaders were amazed, saying, how does this man know so much, having never been taught? Remember what Yeshua's brothers thought was going to happen when he got to Jerusalem? How they thought that the stage in the big city of Jerusalem was going to be too much for Yeshua to handle. Right? Is that how it's going so far? See, the response from the powers that be when they hear him sit up and start teaching in the temple. Well, that boy don't sound like that country boy. That guy must have gone to college somewhere. He must be from Harvard or Oxford or Yale. He's too smart to be from some bumpkin kind of place like Nazareth or the Galilee. And then how are they assessing him? What are they evaluating him by? What does he know so well that amazes them, having never been to one of those assigned schools or sat under one of their approved rabbis? What are they evaluating him by? By the Torah, by the prophets, by the writings. Because he would have it memorized, right? Much more in their day than ours. He would have it memorized. He'd be able to quote it. He'd be able to recall it. He would be able to expound upon it with a kind of natural flow that many of those leaders themselves would have had a hard time doing, right? You know, I'll be the first one to tell you, I'm not a natural speaker. I'm not somebody that gets up here and is always comfortable getting up and sharing and talking. How many of y'all have met people that are? I mean, there are people out there that they can just get up and wing it, and it's like, man, how long have you been preparing that message? And they're like, I just started talking. There are people that have that gift. I'm pretty sure Yeshua had that gift because he knew the scriptures. They were in his heart. He teaches over and over in the Gospels, especially in Mark. he teaches as one who has authority and not one of the Torah scholars, one of the teachers of the law. I mean, wouldn't you expect that from the Messiah? To have the Word, such an understanding of the Word that it amazes even the experts? Wouldn't you expect the living Word, the Word made flesh, to be able to teach and expound on the written Word in a way that is different than anybody else? That should not come as a surprise if he is who he says he is. You know, even the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 knew that the Messiah would bring with him the true Torah, the true practice of the faith. She knew that when Messiah comes, because they had the debate between the Jews and the Samaritans, that he is going to explain everything to us. Messiah is going to settle all the questions and all the debates. He's not coming to undo. He's not coming to negate. He's not coming to nullify the Torah, but to do what? To fulfill it. Which means to bring it to its fullness. Which means to show its perfect expression, to teach it correctly. So Yeshua is not going to be teaching something new. He's teaching something consistent with what has already been revealed, and it's going to be such a way that it doesn't have all of the additions and subtractions and traditions and biases, right? We have biases, don't we? Even when we're trying to approach the Scriptures. He's not going to have all of those things that everybody else brings to the table that become burdens. He is claiming in this moment, when he is here and he is teaching, he's there in the temple. Look at what he claims is his teacher, where he went to school, where he got his credentials. He says in verse 16, Yeshua answered, "My teaching is not from me, but from him who sent me. If anyone wants to do his will, he will know whether my teaching comes from God or it is myself speaking. Whoever speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him." I mean, we need to know and understand, if you haven't figured this out already, every human teacher and leader ultimately has some kind of personal or selfish motive that can affect everything they do and say. Y'all realize that, right? They have pride, they have vanity, they want the attention, they want the recognition, they want the respect from their peers, they want to introduce new and innovative teachings and methods, they want to publish their findings, they want to make it onto the New York Times bestseller list, right? They want the awards, the best seats at the banquets, they want to win the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer. We're no different in our day. I'm no different than that. I could just as easily fall into that. It would not be hard. But Yeshua is different. He's pointing people to the Father. He's pointing people to the Torah. He's not just trying to gain more disciples, more attention, more influence. Otherwise, he would have never gone there secretly. But it's not the time for all of that. He becomes and is becoming a dividing issue, yes, ultimately because none of us really know or keep the Torah as well as we think we do, or as much as we would like to claim. None of us really believe everything rightly. None of us really have a perfect faith without our own slants and biases. In other words, we're not as hospitable to the ways of God as we like to think. We're not as willing to show such hospitality to the appearance of God at our door that we like to assume. If he shows up, that we would jump up like Abraham does and welcomes them to his home. This is how Yeshua keeps going. He says, "Hasn't Moses given you the Torah? Yet none of you keeps it. Why are you trying to kill me?" And the crowd answered, "You must have a demon, right? Who's trying to kill you?" And Yeshua answered, "I did one good work, and all of you are amazed. This one good work that Yeshua is referring to is going back to chapter 5, the healing of the paralytic man on the Shabbat, when he told the man to pick up his mat and walk. And I believe this event was still fresh in everybody's mind because it just happened a few months earlier. And that perspective is a little controversial for some reason. Let me show you why. This is a timeline of how interpretations go. Down here in the bottom is the more traditional. Can y'all read that? Okay, I didn't realize how small it was going to be. On the top is what I believe is the most biblical. In the traditional and in the biblical one, when you look at John chapter 2 and John chapter 5, it's talking about Passover. John chapter 5 mentions an unnamed feast, but with everything along with it, it most likely fits with Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, right? Now in John chapter 7, obviously we're here at what? We're here at Tabernacles, right? And he's going back to Jerusalem. The controversy takes place in what happens in chapter 6 of John. In John chapter 6, it talks about the Jewish feast of Passover. John chapter 6, verse 3 and 4. I've got this here. I'll read this. It says, "Afterwards, Yeshua went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they were watching the signs he was performing on the sick. Then Yeshua went up to the mountainside, and sat down there with his disciples. Passover, the Jewish feast, was near." So the traditional timeline makes this, if you're going to say that, well, that was Passover, so chapter 2 is Passover, chapter 6 is Passover, how much time has passed? A year, right? And since the Passover in chapter 2, he's gone to the temple in chapter 5. He'll be going to the temple in that year in between at Tabernacles. Then he's now back around to going back to the temple in chapter 6 a year later. This traditional timeline, contributes to the idea that Yeshua's ministry lasts about 3.5 years. Right? That's one of the things that they look to. But there is another option. So that makes this Tabernacles almost 1.5 years later. And that other option is in Numbers chapter 9 with what we call the second Passover. Are y'all familiar with that concept, that idea? Numbers chapter 9, as they were celebrating the Passover, says there were some men who could not celebrate Passover because of being defiled by a dead body. And tradition says, why is that? Why are they defiled by a dead body? Y'all remember? Whose body is it that they are defiled by? It's supposed to be Joseph's body, is the tradition. Right? Because he made them promise that he'd be buried in Egypt, but that he made them promise that he was going to take them out of there when they leave. So that's the tradition, is that they are defiled by a dead body because they're fulfilling that promise. So they came to Moses and Aaron on that same day, and these men said to him, "We have become unclean because of a dead man's body. Why should we be kept from presenting the offering of Adonai at the appointed time with the rest of Bnei Israel, with the rest of the children of Israel?" But Moses answered them, "Wait, and I will inquire what Adonai commands concerning you." And then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to Bnei Israel, saying, if any man, whether you or your descendants, becomes unclean because of a dead body, or is away on a long journey, he may yet observe Adonai's Passover. They are to celebrate it at twilight on the 14th day of the second month. With matzot and bitter herbs they are to eat it." So everything that they should have done or would have done in the first month, they're going to do in the second month. And so when you come back to that timeline, you have John chapter 6, and I believe it's the second Passover. And one of the reasons why is if it was Passover, where would Yeshua have to be? He should be in Jerusalem, but he's not. He's up there in the Galilee on the mountainside. Why does he not need to be down there in Jerusalem for Passover? Maybe because he's already had the Passover in the first month. This is Passover in the second month. You following me with that? So in my mind, the most biblical timeline is the one that has the events of chapter 5, not a year and a half later, but just a few months earlier. Actually, it's the last time there was the pilgrimage feast back in Shavuot. So it makes little sense for me to have all of these year and a half multiple pilgrimage feasts in between. And the leadership, if they're really that mad about it, they're so mad about it that they're going to be mad and want to do something about it a year and a half later or whatever else, why would they not have done something at these multiple pilgrimage feasts in between? But if it's that second Passover, he doesn't have to be there for that. And so everything is still just a few months later, 5 to 6 months later. And so it's just, everything is still fresh. And so Yeshua brings that up. He brings up the fact that they were angry that he had healed somebody on Shabbat. And so he addresses this controversy by pointing out another instance where one thing supersedes another. Because Moses has given you circumcision, though it's not really from Moses, but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a man on Shabbat. Right? He goes through and explains this. If a man receives circumcision on Shabbat so that the Torah of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry that I healed a man's whole body on Shabbat? Then he says, do not judge by appearance, but judge righteously. See, circumcision predates the Sinai covenant, doesn't it? Right? Just like the Sabbath. Shabbat really predates the Sinai covenant. The example and practice of Abraham, this circumcision of all of his descendants, is supposed to be upheld. It must be upheld even if that 8th day is the Shabbat. And doing so is not considered a violation of Torah, even though it's a work. It's that important. The one command supersedes the other. There are several other examples of that kind of thing throughout rabbinic writings, even in the Gospels. He talks about how the Levites, every Shabbat, do they work hard on the Shabbat? The Levites, those that are serving in the temple, yeah, they work pretty hard with all of the offerings and all of the sacrifices, but they're not considered to be violating working on Shabbat because they are serving the kingdom of God. So in the same way, Yeshua is coming and saying, healing the whole man, making the man whole, healing him, this paralyzed man, is important, even if it's on Shabbat. This paralyzed man who's been paralyzed for how many years? Do y'all remember? It's 38 years he's been paralyzed. Now, we like to say the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, but how long was it really? I mean, they came out, they stayed at Mount Sinai, building the tabernacle, doing all that stuff. Right? We really say that they wandered around in the wilderness for about 38 years. You think that's interesting? The real time of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. And what is tabernacle supposed to remind us of? The wandering that's going on in the wilderness. Once the wanderings were over, once the people were essentially healed of that unbelieving generation, they were then ready and able to enter into the promised land, that foreshadowing of the Messianic kingdom. And here was this man who had been paralyzed, unable to move forward, unable to go on with life because he's just kind of stuck in a circle, wandering around in the wilderness, so to speak. And Yeshua had compassion. He's showing essentially hospitality to the stranger. Someone who has been wandering through the wilderness, unable to go forward, just like Abraham showed hospitality, just like Abraham showed compassion on these travelers. Yeshua provided for the man's needs, just like Abraham did. Yeshua's his father's house was open for the broken to be restored. That took precedence. Whether everyone else could see it or recognize it or not. And this is the challenge, because sometimes in our zeal to obey God, our zeal and desire to obey His commandments, to keep His commands, sometimes that blinds us to the needs of others. We've got to be careful with all of this, that we lose justice and mercy and compassion in our desire to obey God and His ways. What does Micah 6 tell us, right? He has told you, O man, O humanity, what is good, what Adonai is seeking from you, only to practice justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. What Yeshua did in chapter 5 is no different from this. It's really no different than the parable He told when He was asked by one of the scholars, who is my neighbor? Y'all remember that? Luke chapter 10, he says, a certain Torah lawyer stood up to entrap Yeshua, saying, Teacher, what should I do to gain eternal life? And Yeshua said to him, what has been written in the Torah? How do you read it? And he replied, you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Whoops, I'm missing a passage here, aren't I? Well, let me turn there because I'm missing a slide. I must have missing verse 28. Luke chapter 10, verse 28. So Yeshua said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But wanting to justify him or vindicate himself, he said to Yeshua, then who is my neighbor? I'm missing several slides here. Yeshua replied, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He was attacked by robbers who stripped him and beat him. Then they left, abandoning him as half dead. Right? Y'all remember this so far? It says, and by chance a Cohen was going down that road, but when he saw the man, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was traveling, I don't think that's an accidental word, came upon him, and when he noticed the man, he felt compassion. He went up to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. Then setting him on his own animal, he brought him to a lodge for travelers and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever else you spend upon my return, I will repay you myself. Then Yeshua asks, which of these 3 seems to you a neighbor to the one attacked by robbers? And he said, the one who showed mercy to him. Then Yeshua said to him, go, and you do the same. Now, a lot of times you hear a lot of criticism and bagging on the priest and the Levite, right? I mean, I grew up hearing all sorts of things being said about them. But you know, in all likelihood, they had legitimate, they had legal, they had ceremonial, they had holiness and clean and unclean reasons why they should not stop and help. Y'all realize that, right? They had all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't violate the status they were in, because they were going to Jerusalem likely to serve somewhere in the temple. Their desire to obey and keep the commands was neglecting a person in need. None of those were good enough in the eyes of Messiah, in the eyes of God, to negate their obligation of compassion and hospitality, to open themselves, to open their door up to this stranger. Which of these men acted more like Abraham and his hospitality that is supposed to be the example? Of all people, it's the least expected, the most ungodly, the one that was farthest away from his own home, the Samaritan. And he was the one that was justified in the eyes of Messiah. His tzedakah, his act of righteousness, is of greater value than the righteous acts of the priest or the Levite. The good deed of this Samaritan, like the poor widow, who only put in the two small copper coins into the offering. What did Yeshua say about that? Did she receive greater honor than the one who put in a lot? Yes. It was this compassion. It was this show of hospitality. It was the restoration of the whole man that takes precedence, even on something as important as Shabbat. It's not saying Shabbat's not important. It's saying that there are some things that are more. And so he says, do not judge by the appearance on the surface level, but judge righteously. And tabernacles should teach us that. When we are reminded of our temporary home, when we are reminded that nothing is permanent, when we are reminded that everything that can be taken away, that we can and still will be in need ourselves, can we still share God's provisions in our lives and share them with joy and mercy and compassion? Can we do that? Is it hard sometimes? Yeah. But may we walk in that joy and that compassion and that hospitality, basically have our tabernacle always open, the house of God always open, first here and then in everywhere we go. Amen. Father, we just come before you. I thank you and praise you for all of your provision, all of your goodness. We have far more than we deserve, far more than we can ask for. And Lord, you just want to remind us that sometimes you want to take us out into the wilderness. We need those reminders because you want to prepare us for the greater things that are to come. Prepare us for the Messianic era, the Messianic kingdom that is soon to be at our door. In the meantime, Lord God, may we always show hospitality to those in need, to our friends, our family, our fellowship. And may we glorify your name. In the name of Yeshua. Amen.